to Sufism, which is a fascinating adventure all around. I was exposed to Jalaluddin Rumi, as many in America are, in what Rumi was saying, in how he was saying it. It was giving voice to that urge of the soul. In that moment that I was certain, I had certitude, yaqeen, about the veracity of the Islamic mystical, a sense of joy and sorrow and hope, all wrapped into one what felt like just a mere moment. The modern period wants us to think of our mind over here and our heart over here, and it wants to break the human down. It wants to separate us into pieces, and we don't function when we're separated into pieces. There's a verse, I will show them my signs on the horizon and in their souls. You know, we don't confuse the signs with God. The signs are pointers. Spiritual seekers, Muslims and Christians, we wrestle with the same questions. That's what I mean when I say the Quran is the word of God. It's the logos of God, that it facilitates the opening, the fath of our soul.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we are interviewing Dr. James Shelton Nally from the United States. Dr. James is a PhD student in his 5th and final year in Georgetown University in the States, in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He completed his master's degree in Harvard, and he learned Arabic as well, and Fusus al-Hikam with Professor James Morris there. He also has interest in Islam, Quran, and mystical studies and comparative religion studies. So welcome and nice having you in this talk.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm not a doctor yet, but I'm on my way there. So
hopefully, only 1 year left.
Yes.
So the discussion about spiritual dimensions, transcendent values, virtues is always fascinating and interesting, because it reflects the inner need for sacred meaning. It reflects our existential poorness, our yearning to the real life, and our thirst to God. So first of all, tell us about your personal journey in life, and you consider yourself religious from childhood, or it is a path which you chose with your full awareness as you become elder, and how the interest in religion studies started and developed through your academic path until you are here, having much interest in Islam, Quran, Sufism, and comparative studies between Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, so I mean, in some sense, I've always been religious. I grew up in a very devout Catholic family. So religion was always a significant part of my upbringing. My father did a very good job at instilling the kind of principles and virtues that come with the religious life: prayer, attending Mass, you know, turning in a sense our whole life to that which actually gives us life. And in another sense, that growing up became more foundational when it switched from just being something that I was raised with to being something I began to investigate. Though I'm sure we could say that I wouldn't have this desire to investigate had I not been raised in such a way. So in some sense, the answer is yes to both. I grew up religious, and I also kind of turned towards religion as I got older. And that's actually what kind of sparked my religious inquiry, was growing up religious in North America, particularly as a Catholic in a heavily Protestant kind of milieu. and I began to ask questions of, what is God? What does this do for our spiritual life? Why do we have different ideas about God? And granted, all of this was before my encounter with Islam. And what I began to notice from an early age, around high school, was that different people, though we think of things in different ways, again, this was predominantly in an inter-Christian milieu, being Catholic and engaging with Protestants, so that even though we think of things differently, even though we articulate our thoughts differently, in the end, there is this common desire, this natural urge to give voice to that which is the very foundation of our spiritual life. And we've come to articulate this foundation in different ways based on how we were raised, what our parents taught us, what we've experienced in life. But that this desire, this thrust of the spirit, is something that we all have in common. And then, unfortunately, with the events of 9/11, I began to see people persecuting the very few Muslims that I actually grew up around. And this led to kind of further questioning of, if I see this common spiritual thrust among my Christian brothers and sisters, then there must be some kind of spiritual thrust by virtue of, we're all human. There must be this same spiritual thrust that animates the lives of my Muslim brothers and sisters. And then in seeing Christians act in such hateful ways, even from the young age of being in high school, we're talking people who are 14 years old, 15 years old, acting with such malicious intent to their neighbors simply because they were giving voice to that spiritual desire, that movement of the heart towards God, because they were giving voice to this movement in a way that seemed foreign to them. They felt the need to be malicious. They felt the need to be violent. They felt the need to render us as something different, as opposite, as incompatible. And there was a moment when I was in high school, again, this is kind of just the beginning of this spiritual journey, that I felt a pain, that there was something wrong with this, that there must be some rational way, there must be some way to combat this type of hatred that was fomenting among Christians in the American South. And that led me to kind of address the same questions I had addressed before. When I wanted to know why Catholics and Protestants thought differently, I started reading. And now I wanted to figure out, well, what if these differences, if the different ways of articulating this natural movement of the spirit towards this our transcendent foundation is rooted in our different histories, our different traditions, our different ways of talking, then in order to understand my Muslim brothers and sisters, I had to turn to their tradition. I had to look at their text. I had to find out what were the modes of expression. What is the way that has shaped how they express that desire of the heart. And that's really what started it all. Ended up going to undergraduate, where I studied religion, and I focused on philosophy and religious studies, and that eventually introduced me to Sufism, which is a fascinating adventure all around. I was exposed to Jalaluddin Rumi, as many in America are, through not so reliable channels, because it's become popular to talk about Rumi and make Rumi conformable to American consumer religion. But for better or worse, that's how I came to to this great teacher. And
how did you encounter Rumi and this deep mystical Islamic thought?
it was purely by happenstance. Actually, my two encounters with, I could say, the most profound mystics in my life were, what we could say it was happenstance, we could say it was luck, and more likely I'd be comfortable saying there was something providential about it. But I had come across Rumi just browsing through the library, and I had seen Chittick's book, The Sufi Path of Love, and I looked at that and I was like, well, it's kind of a big book. I don't know if I can read through that. So I put it back, and I actually picked up a book by Coleman Barks, who has done, we could say he's done some good in getting Rumi's name out there, but he's done a lot more harm in, how he's kind of manipulated what Rumi has said. But nonetheless, I read Coleman Barks' rendition, we could call it, or interpretation of Rumi's poetry, and felt a connection to it. I felt that in what Rumi was saying, in how he was saying it, it was giving voice to that urge of the soul that I was talking about. In all of our spiritual journeys, we're never done finding new ways to speak, because the movement of the heart, the desire of the soul, because of its object, the object of its desire, God, is infinitely greater than anything we are. We will never be able to exhaustively explain in our limited words that desire. And in acquiring a new way of speaking, which, I don't want to belittle this point, but that's exactly what I found when I turned to Rumi, is I found a new way of being able to talk about what is that restless movement of the soul. And that really started my journey off. And after I threw away the Coleman Barks book and became, a little bit more knowledgeable about how translations work, what translations to trust, what scholars to trust, and understanding Rumi, understanding how Rumi fits in to the larger tradition of Islam, I became more and more grounded in that kind of way of expressing, in the insights that Rumi was giving voice to in his poetry. And I think in doing that, it helped me grow as a spiritually seeking person, which culminated in an instance of, I don't want to overstate it, but it had an experience where I was reading from the Methnewī, and at my desk I have a crucifix, and I experienced somewhat of a unitive moment in which I saw myself on the crucifix rather than Christ on the crucifix. And this is directly connected to my reading of the Methnewī. And it was in that moment, in that moment that I was certain, I had certitude, yaqeen, about the veracity of the Islamic mystical tradition of Sufism, that this was not, to use the words of St. Paul, these were not empty gongs and listless speech, that in the expression of these Sufi masters was something fundamental to the human soul. And with that kind of certitude, not just in my intellect, but in my very will, and in that desire of the soul, that I was moving in the right direction, it just solidified my entire area of study. And I spent the rest of my life, even now, devoted towards studying Christianity and Islam, particularly Sufism, side by side.
So it was a moment of a real deep spiritual experience which penetrated inside yourself, inside your existence. So if you can describe it a bit more, so what exactly happened? And this is what like mystics talk about, the certain graces or moments that God gives a person.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say a lot about it, partially because the experience itself escapes words. I mean, when I had this kind of vision of transposition, if you want to call it that, it wasn't a discursive experience. The experience itself was rooted deep within kind of the affective powers of the soul. It was overwhelming gratitude. It was a deep sense of contrition. It was a realization of the limited contained within the limitless. It was a sense of joy and sorrow and hope, all wrapped into one what felt like just a mere moment. But it's something that I've held on to, and even in those moments of study where things get tedious, and I have to write some kind of paper, and I don't want to write it. I want to do something else. It's that moment that I return to that reminds me once again that what I'm doing is the right thing.
So you still remember that moment, and you can recall it, like even if several years have passed, huh?
Yeah, I don't want to say I recall it exactly as it was. What I can recall the certitude that it gave me, and I can kind of recall intellectually the way I felt when it was done. But I can't make myself feel that particular way again. I can't make, because ultimately that very experience itself was a gift, or we could say that it was a state, a hal. It wasn't a station. So the moment came and went, but I hold on to what that was in my memory, and it keeps me going.
But isn't it scary, like a moment that is totally out of context and it happens once in the life of a human being, or?
I think it can be. It's certainly, I could definitely hypothesize a person who has such an experience, and they might go on to think they're crazy. They might think that they were experiencing some kind of
An illusion or something.
And I think that's certainly one way a person can feel. And in doing so, I'd say they would be lacking the kind of certitude of that moment. Like I was saying, the yaqeen of it. But I can only say that within the moment of that gift, the certitude was given with it. That in a way that 2 + 2 = 4. Your mind can't reject the truth value of 2 + 2 = 4. In the depths, I could not reject the veracity of that moment. There was no way that I could just say that I was in a state of delusion or psychosis. My mind wouldn't assent to such a proposition.
You pray for having such similar states, or you believe that it's a gift that it comes when it comes from God?
Yeah, I can say I haven't prayed to have that happen again. I would certainly welcome it. But I've read enough of the spiritual masters to know that these experiences are not our goal. That our goal is ultimately praise and worship of God, and that if we pray for these experiences, as good as they may be, we end up idealizing the experience rather than giving true worship. And that's a road I'd rather not go down.
Yeah, because we are following our ego then and our certain interests then will be. As you experience such a moment, when you analyze, you can differentiate that all the studies that are related to concepts and thinking and academic work and scholarly work is different than such spiritual moments, because all the work that we do is all conceptual with our brains. So we believe that there is a real difference between the yaqeen in concepts and the yaqeen when a person witnesses something.
Yeah, I think, well, I want to be careful about how we make the distinction between, say, a self-evident proposition versus the type of spiritual certitude that comes as, you know, a divine grace, a gift, fadl. I don't think that they are in opposition to one another. So I don't want to say that these ideas are unrelated. You know, the kind of mental certitude we get through our ability of reason and the type of certitude that comes with a spiritual experience founded in, you know, the latching on of the soul to its source, but that they have an analogous relationship to one another. That is, we can have a type of spiritual certitude through these, you know, divine mercies, through these gifts, and that we can, after the fact, reflect upon them. I mean, that's one of the very, very gifts that we have in virtue of being created as human, is we have this mental capacity to reflect on our experiences. And that in reflecting upon the certitude that comes as a gift, we can bring the rational ability and the kind of emotive or affective power of the soul into a harmony that work cooperatively to help us along our spiritual journey as we, you know, move through the trials of life in the dunya.
So both the intellectual understanding of a human being and the spiritual abilities, they both complete each other. So a person develops in both sides. It's not only a certain side. Or we can talk about, there is a real side, which is the spirit, and then there is a very surface side, which is the brain. Both sides should always develop together.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when I think of the soul, you know, what we'd say is the ruh. You know, within the soul is both our reason and our affection. That these are principles within the soul itself, and so we can, in some sense, use our reason devoid of revelation. We can use our reason devoid of the gift of God's, you know, self-disclosure. And in doing so, it would be like trying to, this is going to be a crude example, but it would be like trying to do geometry without knowing addition, subtraction, and basic arithmetic. We would be trying to do something with our soul that our soul is not capable of doing completely on its own. And if we want to develop as human persons, as full spiritual creatures, then we can't just try to operate fully and wholly on our own reliance. That, as we have to be knowledgeable enough about what our reason can accomplish to be humble enough to allow our reason to be opened up to something more. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It is an issue like when they talk about faith. Is it a matter of rational understanding or it's a matter of heart? Because Quran always talk about heart, al-qalb, lahum qulub, or al-qalb al-munib. So because normally the religions and its very well-known system, the famous systems of religions, it has a conceptual belief system. gained by thinking, analyzing, to reach to conclusions by logic. And they give very precise, justified methods. Whereas we feel that the real faith experience, it's a matter of a deep spiritual experience in the heart. And it's a continuous question towards knowing God more and understand reality in an unending journey. So so sometimes you find a belief system which has a shape and a form where a believer should take it for granted, where the spiritual path is always open to know truth more and more, and to know it by your experience, not by the given very precise system.
Right. I think that's certainly a symptom of the modern mind, where we have a tendency to make idols out of our doctrinal systems, out of our ways of speaking. And we shouldn't be confused that these systems that you're speaking of, doctrines, dogma, systematizations, all that these are, and we should recognize them for what they are, is they are once again expressions of this inner yearning of the soul. And as expressions, they are just one expression among many. And this is why I think it's important for us to recall, as Ghazali has pointed out, that the intellect, akal, is just another name for the heart, kelb, which is just another name for ruh, which is just another name for nafs. That all of these things, whenever we try, as the modern period has wanted us to do, the modern period wants us to think of our mind over here and our heart over here, and it wants to break the human down. It wants to separate us into pieces. And we don't function when we're separated into pieces, that we were created as a whole, and it's as a whole that we truly move and grow as we're spiritually destined to do.
So the human being is more complicated than trying to separate him to the different.
Exactly.
Okay. Here, let us go to another topic which is very important, and obviously we start talking about it, which is the issue of religious pluralism when talking about others, and in the experience that you mentioned in the beginning, because you were talking about the unity between the Christ and reading Rumi, or reading the Quranic explanations of Rumi. So there is some kind of unity that I don't know if you'd like to mention something about the experience there.
Yeah, I think, again, it's certainly a complicated question, and I don't want to undersell it or overcomplicate it. But anyone who can claim about the reality of God, if anyone says that God is real, there's obviously people who will deny that assertion. But if we take that idea seriously, that God is real, God is the truth, God is, being, haq, wujud, all these things, then we can't help but to acquiesce the position that anyone who experiences God, regardless of what tradition they are in, is experiencing the same thing. But the difficulty lies in, again, how do we articulate this, and how do we understand what that experience is? Because in virtue of being created by God, with this ability to seek God and to, inshallah, in the next life, when we have kind of left this bodily world, and when we have what Catholics call the beatific vision of God, when we have that, that'll be a different story. But right now, we are very limited in our ability to even reflect on any experience we have. This, as I was trying to get at with my own faith journey, my own religious journey, I can reflect upon what I experienced, but my reflection will never encompass the totality of what I experienced that day. And because my reflection can't encompass that totality, how I speak about it is going to fall even further short of reflecting that reality. It's like you have something reflected in a mirror, and then that image is reflected in another mirror, and then that image is reflected in another mirror. And each time it gets a little bit more distorted. It becomes that, this final reflection. We could say that how we talk about it is our final reflection, but it's passed through so many mirrors of different shapes and sizes and clarity that it only vaguely resembles that original source, that original experience. And so even if what is being said is in some sense true, it is also in another sense false. When we give voice to our experience of God through our traditions, through revelation as we know it, through those private, quiet encounters when we're in a state of prayer, even if what we say is in some sense true, it falls short of what it's trying to attain to. And that's just kind of the human condition. We are finite things. We are limited. We are contracted and restricted to our cultures. We're restricted to our geography. We're restricted to what we can articulate. And so in looking at other people and having these types of conversations with other people, we have to not only listen with our reason, with our mind, but we have to more intently listen with our heart. We have to kind of step in as best we can to feel what they are trying to give voice to. And it's there that religious pluralism comes together in a unity, not so much an intellectual unity or a discursive unity, but an affective unity of two souls working together to try and get to this highest good, this foundation of our life.
With all the limitations of culture, language, society, theological doctrines that we think through. So these are all limitations where we can't present our ideas in a very justified or logical way to other people. We might feel that it is well-shaped theory, but another person, he's in a total different context.
Right. And it's important to keep in mind that what these things are, we shouldn't confuse the way of speech, the way of reasoning and rationalizing and understanding with the object it is seeking to understand and articulate. There's a verse, I will show them my signs on the horizon and in their souls. We don't confuse the signs with God. The signs are pointers, but as soon as we start idealizing our doctrines and our dogmas and our way of speech, as soon as we turn those into idols and we confuse the signs for God, then pluralism sets us up one against each other rather than providing us the opportunity to learn from one another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Before going deeply more in the issue of religious pluralism, you had a try in your master's degree dissertation where you tried to compare between the doctrine of Trinity based on the theories of Thomas Aquinas, and then compare it to the وحدة الوجود, the unity of being, as stated with Ibn Arabi and Qunawi and Mullah Sadra, the Sufi doctrine. Mm-hmm. So this try, so if you can talk like a summary about the goals of this try, and you believe that you did a certain success or you presented a certain understanding yourself.
Yeah, so what the thrust of kind of my thinking and exploration, and I should say it's still something I think about and revisit, and I'm always in the process of revising, rejecting, revisiting, and getting myself confused. It's thinking not just how does Aquinas articulate the doctrine of the Trinity, but rather what is his goal? What is he trying to accomplish in, at what he articulates as Trinitarian theology? Because again, we don't want to confuse what is said with what somebody is trying to say about. So if we think of Aquinas's articulation of Trinitarian doctrine, we have to ask ourselves, what is he trying to point us to? What reality is he trying to help our minds and our souls rise up to? And it's in turning to that question then that I turn to Ibn Arabi and Qunawi, because I see in both of them this attempt to get us to recognize the kind of inner dynamism of God's reality, and doing so at different levels of discourse, in some sense talking about trying to talk about God in either theological terms or ontological terms. I mean, there's in the Foss of Adam, Ibn Arabi talks, he gives us this phrase, it's very short, but he calls it al-Fayd al-Aqdas, the most holy effusion. And we're kind of left questioning, what is that? He doesn't say a whole lot there about what the al-Fayd al-Aqdas is. And then, from this most holy effusion, we get the holy effusion, and there is this connection between the two. And we look at, okay, this holy effusion we could kind of try to understand in terms of creation, because this is where everything other than God kind of appears within being. This is when all of the Atyan are kind of clothed in God's existence. So we could say, okay, this is some kind of concept or term that is related to creation. And if we take creation as that kind of demarcating factor of separating God from everything other than God, then in some sense, this most holy effusion, this Fayd al-Aqdas, is on the side before creation. So how do we understand that? Well, effusion, Fayd, it's this movement, this overflowing, which then through Qunawi gets connected with God's knowledge. So in some sense, God's knowledge is this most holy effusion where God knows God's self, and God is dynamically flowing into God's self. Now, all of this we can kind of conceptualize very poorly, but we can begin to think about it. And Qunawi wants to say in, I believe it was in the Nasus, it was either in the Nasus or the Fakuk, that any positive thinking we have about God, anytime our ideas try to encapsulate or reflect God's reality, well, the only thing we're talking about at this point is the first intification, this in a sense limitingness of God, because we're finite, our ideas are finite. So all of these ideas are going to be in somewhat limited, and as such can't really reflect what God is.
It's created from our brains. So I think you're referring to the hadith which says كل ما توهمتموه في عقولكم فهو مخلوق لكم مردود عليكم. So whatever you try to shape an idea or theory or conceptual theory about God, it's a thing that you created yourself with your limitations.
Mm-hmm. So the question then becomes, is what is this relationship between the dynamism that Ibn Arabi is describing? How is that related to how we conceive of God? And then how is that conception of God related to what and who God is in itself? This, wujud mutlaq, this limitless, pure being that we can't conceive of. And so in that sense, I see a kind of agreement between Aquinas and the Akbari tradition of Ibn Arabi and Kunawi and Kashani and all these people, is that what Aquinas is trying to do with his discussion on the Trinity, kind of separated from the questions of the incarnation. That's a whole different set of questions. But what he's trying to do with his discussions on the Trinity is to get us to realize that when we're thinking about God, when we think of God as Trinity, he wants us to realize how limited our concept is and how much more God is than just what we're thinking. And because of the nature of trying to think this way, it forces the soul and the mind to keep pushing more. It's almost like a perpetual motion device that as we think about it, we're forced to stretch ourselves more and more and more, to the point that eventually we end up in, what Ibn Arabi calls a sense of bewilderment, where the rational powers of the soul just kind of give way just to be open to what God wants to share of God's self to us.
So what was the term you mentioned? You mean ilham, you mean?
Not ilham. That's more of a, this idea of spiritual inspiration. I'm trying to think of the Arabic term. It's a sense of spiritual bewilderment, where
maybe, or
say again.
Al-Fana?
No, I'm sorry, I can't think of the term right now. But it's where we use the power of reason, and then we use that to try and articulate the experience of our heart, the pool of our heart, and we do so in such a way that it stretches reason to its almost to its breaking point, so that reason then is forced to kind of humbly, throw down its hands. Not that reason then becomes discarded, but rather than trying to get to the source itself, it decides to open itself up to receive the source as a gift.
We call it al-aql al-munawwar, the reason that is enlightened, so for example.
Yeah.
Great.
Exactly. That's where I see this point of Aquinas and Ibn Arabi and Kunawi, Mullah Sadra, kind of coming together in trying to get us as spiritual seekers to get to that point. And I think Aquinas is misread whenever people read him as saying, well, this is what God is, because I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's trying to train us so that we can humbly accept, rather than so that we can master and understand.
I think you also used the Sufi interpretations of for example, the 99 names of God as Ibn Arabi understood them, because we have 99 names and then we have one essence and one God. And the other idea is that this debate about the Quran, it is eternal or it is created. So it is created in the same time that it is eternal. If you're talking about the knowledge of God, obviously it is eternal. If you're talking about these words and terminologies and the book that is in our hands, so it is created. So I think you try to use these theories in a Sufi point of view, and also try to compare it with the mystery of Trinity.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do there is not so much that what I'm trying to do with that is not so much say that these are the same things with reference to God, but rather to show that as spiritual seekers, Muslims and Christians, we wrestle with the same questions, And when we approach these questions, either with Christians talking about this relationship between the humanity and divinity of Christ, or with Muslims talking about whether the Quran is created or uncreated, that these questions that we're asking are similar. And so if Christians can approach the way they think about Christ in the same way Muslims are approaching how we can think about the created or uncreated nature of the Quran, then we can come together in a more harmonious understanding of one another. And thus, in fostering a deeper understanding of one another, we open ourselves up to one another and learning, again, new ways of articulating that deep desire of the soul. So that's kind of what I'm doing there. Not so much to talk about God, but looking at how we try to talk about God and how we can learn and work with one another.
Great, great. The final issue in here in your master's degree articles that you wrote, it's the issue that every Muslim faces with some Quranic verses about Christianity. We have some positive verses and some negative verses. So the verses that Quran criticized Christian beliefs, I think you present this idea that it was directed to certain Christian groups which existed in Arabia that time. And it is not, it can't be generalized to all different groups of Christianity and all different doctrines of theology. And I think this is an important point for any reader, Muslim or not Muslim, when reading Quran, that Quran didn't criticize everything in Christianity. However, we have some verses that praise also some groups of Christian people who cry and who do prayers and yeah.
Yeah, so I think what's fundamental for me in looking at these different and diverse ayat in the Quran that refer to Christianity or refer to different ideas, it's the presupposition that I take with full force that the Quran is the revealed speech of God. So if we take that as a presupposition, then
no, but about this statement, so as a Christian or your personal idea, can you believe that Quran is the word of God and from a Christian point of view? Because it's a final religion and it's the belief of Muslims. So you can believe in both religions together.
So this is, again, coming with our distinction between what you just mentioned earlier, this kind of difference between the created and uncreated Quran. If we talk about, just the book that is on the top of my shelf that's written in Arabic, I can look at when this book was printed, when the ink was put on the pages. In this sense, it's certainly created. I can look at the publisher. I can see when it came off the line. But in another very real sense, in a very deep and profound sense, what that created pages and ink and binding does is it opens up the soul in a way that makes the soul, what's the word? It makes the soul vulnerable to the word of God. So the createdness of it almost acts, in Catholicism we have this term sacrament. So it acts almost sacramentally, that through its createdness it opens us up unto something that's greater than its createdness, and that would be the uncreated word, the logos, as we say in Christianity. And that's what I mean when I say the Quran is the word of God. It's the logos of God, that it facilitates the opening, the fath of our soul. And in taking that seriously, then we kind of have to now go in the inverse way. So we moved from this createdness of it to what opens us up to the uncreated. And if we take that seriously, then the uncreated was intentional in what became known as the created, like, dimension of it. And I would not want to be the person who says God does things unintentionally, or God does not know, the full range of what can be said. So obviously, God being all-knowing, in using the created Arabic words, that originated in time at a particular space, that then got written down at a certain time and compiled in a certain way. That God being all-knowing knew how that process would unfold. And so the words that are present in the kind of created dimension of the Quran are intentional. So we can't dismiss what's present just because it's just a kind of a created side. It's the ayat side of what opens us up to what the sign points to. We can't just dismiss it out of hand.
And through a personal experience, you can feel when reading Quran that it has a light, or it has wisdom that penetrates inside the self.
Yeah. So by taking that seriously, and then simultaneously taking seriously my own, I guess you could say, Christian tradition, my own experiences as a Christian. On the one hand, I could say, well, I'm experiencing two different things here, and I have a contradiction. And if I say, okay, I have a contradiction, I have to pick one or the other. But then there's the question: is this a contradiction, or is this a paradox? Something that looks like a contradiction, but actually is not. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that our ways of articulating things are always going to be an inadequate and poor reflection of the thing they're trying to articulate. And so when I take seriously the text of the Quran as trying to point me towards the uncreated dimension of God's word, then I have to ask questions. Why does the Quran say that only I think it's in chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, it says a group of them were misled, or a group of them made modifications. And if I take that seriously, it's not just arbitrary speech, then, we can say, okay, if a group were making these changes, if a group was led astray, it's not saying, everyone was led astray. And if the Quran simultaneously says, what we gave to Moses and what we gave to David, what we gave to Jesus, we also give this to you, to confirm what went before you and to finalize what you have now. If we take that seriously, then we see a unity between the revelation we get from Moses. We see a unity from the revelation we get with Jesus within the revelation that was given to Muhammad. And so the question then becomes, how do we, as not just rational and intellectually curious people, but how do we as spiritual seekers reconcile that? And not in a type of arbitrary reconciliation, or not in a dismissive reconciliation, but in such a way that it keeps our soul moving towards that source. Because any rationalization that appears to placate the soul, any kind of rationalization that seems to give our soul what it wants, is going to be inadequate, because it's particularly that, our rationalization. So we have to be able to think and reason in such a way that keeps us open to further mercies, further gifts.
Especially when applying a hermeneutic understanding of such verses, so one can keep them in certain contexts. So in the beginning, they would look criticizing, but then you can understand their context that they came in.
Right.